The worth of a man is not measured by what he keeps, but by what he's willing to give up when no one's watching. Have you ever seen someone do something so selfless it made you question what you'd do in the same situation? Let us know in the comments section below, and be sure to subscribe, as this story might just restore your faith in humanity. Neil Curtis didn't believe in luck, good or bad. He believed in preparation, in torque wrenches, in getting to the site on time, and logging the job correctly. He also believed in Motel 6 points, gas station burritos, and that quiet moment at the end of a long day when the job's done, the boots come off, and the TV's volume is set just loud enough to forget how alone you are. Neil wasn't chasing anything. Not promotions, not dreams, just trying to make it to the next job, with enough left in his bank account to get by. The lobby of the roadside inn buzzed faintly with fluorescent light. He tapped his phone against the counter, trying to coax a single bar of signal to call dispatch. No luck. He glanced toward the glass doors, where thick flurries of snow smeared the night sky into a blur of white noise. The storm hadn't been in the forecast. Not that it mattered. He was already checked in, room 207, top floor, quiet side. Just how he liked it. Behind the front desk, the clerk, young, tired, and painfully disinterested, handed Neil a plastic key card without looking up from her phone. "Stairs on the left, elevators down again," she said with a practiced yawn. Neil gave her a polite nod, took the key, and turned, only to find himself face to face with a man standing just inside the doorway, shaking snow from his shoulders like a dog coming out of a river. He was older, 60s, maybe 70s. Vietnam-era fatigue jacket soaked through, duffel bag hanging heavy off one shoulder. His beard was scraggly, not styled. His eyes were pale and bloodshot, but alert, watching. "Room for one more?" the man asked, his voice rasping with cold or disuse. "Or both?" The clerk looked up, her expression souring. "No, vacancy." Neil felt something twist inside his chest. He turned slightly, his boots scraping the linoleum. The man noticed him, gave a nod like they were already familiar. They weren't. The clerk added with zero apology, "Blizzard hit early. The last room just got taken." The older man's shoulders sank just slightly, not theatrically, not in defeat, just enough to say he'd been here before, that he'd expected this. Neil glanced down at the keycard in his hand, then at the man, and finally at the window, where the wind slapped against the glass like it was trying to get in. "Sir," Neil said, clearing his throat, "you a vet?" The man hesitated. "Army, 71 to 75, Fort Benning, then Saigon." Neil nodded slowly. He didn't ask for proof. Didn't need to. "You hungry?" "Not really," the man said. "I just need somewhere warm." 1,000 excuses bloomed in Neil's mind like weeds. He had an early call time. The bed was already calling, the motel walls were thin, and he didn't do well with small talk. But none of them made it past his throat. "I'll walk back to town," Neil said, handing the card to the man. "It's not far." The clerk blinked. "Sir, you can't—" Neil cut her off with a raised hand. "He can have my room." The old man didn't say thank you, not at first. He just took the card, nodded again, like that silent kind of thank you that means more than the words ever could, and stepped past Neil into the hallway. "Name's Walt," he said quietly as he passed. "Walter Briggs." "Neil," Neil replied, already pulling on his coat. He stepped into the blizzard like a man diving into a wave, the cold slicing into him with every step. His boots crunched ice and buried curbs. The wind howled like it had teeth, and for a second Neil wondered if this was the stupidest thing he'd ever done. By the time he reached the edge of town, his face was raw, his phone was dead, and his fingers were starting to go numb. But he didn't regret it. Not yet. Not even when he spent the night shivering inside a closed diner's vestibule, his collar turned up against the wind. Because that look in Walter's eyes, that quiet, tired recognition of someone who'd spent too many nights being turned away. It had burned into him, and Neil, who never chased anything, had just stumbled into the beginning of something far bigger than himself. 2 weeks would pass before the knock on his door. 2 weeks before the world reminded him that sometimes the smallest act, done without witness or reward, can echo all the way up the chain of command. But tonight, Neil Curtis was just a man walking alone through a snowstorm, hoping the coffee shop opened early. Neil's boots sat drying on a rubber mat near the baseboard heater, curled slightly inward as if they too had gotten caught off guard by the storm. His socks, stiff from the night before, hung on the bathroom towel rack of a budget roadside motel he'd stumbled into after walking nearly 5 miles in the cold. The manager, an older woman with bad knees and good instincts, hadn't asked too many questions when she saw the half-frozen man at her door just after sunrise. She just handed over a room key and muttered something about people with heart being in short supply these days. Neil hadn't thought much of it. By morning, his phone had a faint charge, enough to buzz through a voicemail from his supervisor, wondering if he'd made it to the installation site in Harrisonville. Neil texted back a simple, delayed, storm, all good, and left it at that. No mention of why he was actually delayed, no point. He sipped the last of the lukewarm motel coffee and checked the window again. The snow had softened into a steady whisper against the glass, no longer raging but still thick on the ground. The town plows hadn't made it to this stretch of road yet, and the world outside remained heavy, blanketed, hush. A soft knock interrupted the quiet. Not loud, almost hesitant, a quick set of 3, followed by silence. Neil pulled on his flannel, half expecting it to be the motel manager asking for payment or an early checkout. But when he opened the door, it wasn't her. It was a man in uniform. Stiff wool coat, ribbons gleaming against the gray, silver hair close-cropped under a Navy-style peacoat, square jaw, steady eyes, and a presence that made the narrow hallway feel suddenly smaller. "You're Neil Curtis?" the man asked, voice calm but clipped, as though he was accustomed to needing only one repetition to get what he needed. Neil nodded slowly, eyes flicking from the man's face to the ID badge clipped to his lapel. Dean Holloway, U.S. Army, R-Reet. "Yes, sir," Neil said instinctively. "Oh," Holloway offered a hand. Not aggressively, not even formally, just steady. "Mind if I come in?" Neil hesitated only a second before stepping aside. The colonel moved like someone who was used to pacing briefing rooms and command centers, but even now he carried no sense of superiority, just purpose. He paused in the center of the room, eyes scanning briefly over the modest furnishings, the socks still drying, the motel Bible on the nightstand unopened. He turned back to Neil. "I won't take much of your time. I came here to deliver something. A message." Neil frowned. "A message?" "From a man named Walter Briggs." Neil blinked. "He okay?" The colonel's mouth curved upward in a brief, unreadable smile. "That depends how you define okay. Physically, he's stable. He checked into a VA-supported housing facility just outside Junction City a few days ago. Got medical attention, warm bed. He's being looked after." Neil exhaled. "Good. Thanks to you." Neil waved it off. "I didn't do anything. You gave up the one warm bed left in a blizzard," Holloway said, stepping closer. "That's not nothing. That's the kind of gesture most people talk about wanting to make, but rarely do." Neil leaned against the table, arms crossed, trying not to feel seen. It was the right thing." "Funny thing about doing the right thing," Holloway said, reaching into the inside of his coat, pulling out a worn envelope. "People tend to remember it, especially men like Walt." He handed Neil the envelope. The paper was rough, the handwriting sharp and controlled but wavering just slightly, like someone who didn't write often anymore. Neil opened it. A single sheet. A short note, handwritten. You didn't know me, but you didn't hesitate. That doesn't happen often. The world's colder than it used to be, but you reminded me it hasn't frozen all the way. I told Dean about you, thought he should know men like you still exist. Thank you, Walt Briggs. Neil read it twice, folded it once, set it down. You served with him? Neil asked. Not exactly. I command a regional network of veteran outreach initiatives. Walter's name was in our database from way back. He never reached out. Always said others had it worse. The colonel paused. He never talked about that night. Until now. Neil swallowed. Why come all the way here? Because I want to offer you a job, Holloway said, the words falling into the quiet room like something both impossible and inevitable. Not a handout, a purpose. Neil straightened slightly. I'm just a technician. I fix HVAC units, wiring, that kind of thing. And how many people do you see a week? Neil blinked. 10, sometimes more. Exactly. Holloway stepped forward. We run a vet shelter network, small, regional, personal. But one of the biggest challenges we face? Isolation. We don't always need case managers or therapists first. We need connectors, people who look someone in the eye and ask, "Are you okay?" and who'll listen to the answer. Neil was quiet. The coffee on the table had gone cold, but he didn't move to touch it. Walter said he hadn't had someone look at him without suspicion in years, Holloway added. That's not just kindness, Mr. Curtis. That's leadership. Neil scoffed gently, eyes dropping. I'm no leader. Not yet, the colonel said. But you're the kind of man we need more of. The silence stretched. Then Neil nodded slowly. What? You get a card or something? Colonel Holloway smiled and handed him one. We'll talk again. Think about it. Then he was gone just as fast as he'd arrived, leaving behind a draft of cold air and something else Neil hadn't felt in years, a sense that maybe, just maybe, there was more for him than motel rooms and service tickets. The letter sat on the table, weighted only by a motel coffee mug. Outside, the snow began to melt under the weak morning sun, dripping quietly from the awning in slow, steady drops. Neil Curtis had never worn a badge. He wasn't military, wasn't law enforcement. The closest thing he'd ever had to a uniform was the gray collared shirt with Curtis Electrical embroidered in crooked thread above the heart. But now, 3 weeks after a stranger's letter and a commander's handshake, he was standing in front of a narrow mirror in a converted office space formerly a dry cleaner's, and adjusting the laminated ID badge clipped to his chest. The logo read VANET, Veterans Assistance Network, and beneath it, Neil Curtis, Community Liaison, Region 3B. He'd said yes. He wasn't sure why. Not exactly. It wasn't for the money, though the pay was better than his contracting gigs. It wasn't for recognition, either. Most of the time, no one even noticed him when he walked into the shelters. But there was something about the quiet resolve in Colonel Holloway's voice that stuck with Neil long after the man had left, like the weight of that envelope Walt Briggs had written, like the eyes of someone who'd been invisible too long and finally felt seen. And Neil was on the other side of that door, and he wasn't quite sure what he was doing. The day began early, earlier than he was used to, not with job site calls or busted heat pumps, but with a clipboard and a community van. He drove north into cold towns still dusted in salt from the blizzard weeks ago, where rusting metal chairs lined the back walls of local churches, and every other business had a faded yellow ribbon decal peeling off the front window. His first visit of the morning was a drop-in shelter tucked behind a shuttered laundromat. Inside, the air smelled of dust and reheated soup. Cots lined the back wall. Volunteers worked quietly. Some knew him already. Others didn't bother learning names. Just nodded, appreciated the coffee he brought, and went back to folding blankets. Neil didn't mind. His job wasn't to take over. It was to notice. He kept his eyes moving, gentle but observant, looked for the guy hunched in the corner with the same socks for 4 days straight, for the woman who never made eye contact and flinched at loud voices, for the man sitting near the exit, back always to the wall. He wasn't a therapist. He didn't pretend to be. But he could ask, "Need a ride?" He could say, "There's a bed in Junction City." He could dial numbers. Others were too tired to try anymore. Around noon, he sat beside an older man on the shelter's porch. The man's name was Ronnie, Vietnam vet. Neil didn't ask about the war. He just handed him a sandwich and sat with him while they both watched a city plow pass like a slow-moving tank. "You knew?" Ronnie asked, eyeing the badge. "Kind of," Neil said, still figuring it out. Ronnie chuckled low and hoarse. "Aren't we all?" By 2 o'clock, Neil had driven 45 miles and stopped at 2 more sites. He wasn't keeping a strict schedule yet. Holloway had told him the first month was about learning the pulse of the circuit, not perfecting it. Every site was different, some buzzing with noise, others so quiet you could hear the baseboard heaters click on and off, and each had their own kind of tension, the kind that lives where people are grateful but guarded, where pride keeps pace with pain. At the last stop of the day, a shelter in an old VFW hall, Neil noticed a woman sitting outside on the steps. No coat, just a thin green hoodie stretched over her knees. She wasn't shivering. She looked beyond that, like she'd folded herself into the cold. Neil approached slowly, holding out a paper cup of coffee. She didn't look up. "It's not great," he said, "but it's hot." She took it without a word, fingers wrapping around it like it was currency. "I'm Neil," he added. "I work with the network. I'm not staff here, just checking in." She nodded slightly, then finally glanced at him. "Callie," she said, "was Navy." The past tense didn't escape him. "I'm glad you're here," Neil said, and he meant it. They sat in silence for a bit. The wind had picked up again, not quite a storm, but threatening something sharp. After a moment, she spoke again. "Don't get a lot of people like you." He frowned. "People like me?" "Guys who don't talk to you like you're broken glass," she said, "like they're afraid you'll crack." Neil's chest tightened. "We all crack sometimes." Callie gave a small, almost smile. "Yeah, but most folks treat you like you'll cut 'em if you do." He nodded, let the silence stretch again. He didn't need to fill it. Later that night, back in his apartment, a plain one-bedroom on the edge of town, Neil sat at the tiny kitchen table, the one with the dent from the time he dropped a microwave. He stared at the form Holloway had emailed him. Staff observations log. He was supposed to write reflections, notes about the day. He typed a few lines, then erased them. Typed again. Ronnie, Army keeps to himself but responsive, warmed up to conversation. Callie, Navy, high alert, needs space but accepted help. Offered name. Engaged when not pressured. He stopped, sat back, then added one more line. Beginning to understand that connection isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just presence. He hit save. Closed the laptop. The apartment was quiet. Too quiet, maybe. But for the first time in a long time, Neil didn't feel alone. He didn't feel like he was passing through a world that had nothing to do with him. Out there, somewhere, was Walter Briggs, maybe sitting in a recliner at the VA facility watching old westerns or complaining about the coffee. And out there were people like Ronnie and Callie, whose stories hadn't been told yet, who didn't need saving, just someone willing to knock, to listen, to stay. And here he was. Not a hero, not a veteran, but a man with a badge clipped to his chest and boots dry by the heater. For the first time, it felt like a kind of uniform, and it fit. The knock was polite, 2 firm taps, followed by one softer, not the kind you get from someone trying to sell you something or someone impatient. It was intentional, familiar. Neil rose from the chair in his small office at the Junction City Outreach Center, half expecting it to be the new intake coordinator who'd started last week and hadn't yet figured out how to reset the copy machine. He pulled open the door with a tired smile. But it wasn't her. Walt Briggs stood there, posture better than Neil remembered, wearing a flannel shirt that looked clean and warm, tucked into a pair of jeans that fit just right. His beard had been trimmed down, jawline visible now, and though his eyes still held that same tired weight, there was something new layered behind it. Steadiness. "Walt," Neil said, caught off guard, but glad, deeply glad. "You look good." Walt gave a small shrug, then stepped in and embraced Neil without asking. It wasn't a long hug, but it carried the weight of 1,000 unsaid things. When he stepped back, Walt spoke. "Took me longer than I wanted to get here. They've had me going to appointments, assessments, this group therapy thing twice a week." "You stuck with it," Neil said. Walt nodded. "I promised myself I would. Told myself if I got clean, got my VA coverage sorted, and got out of that hotel rotation, I'd look you in the eye and tell you thank you proper. You don't owe me anything." "No, I do," Walt said. "You gave up something that night, and it did something to me. I'd gotten used to the idea that nobody gave a damn, that if I froze out there, people would step over me and go back to their coffee. I didn't think it would matter much," Neil admitted, "but I couldn't walk past." "You didn't," Walt said. "And now I can't either." Neil tilted his head, curious. "I've been volunteering," Walt continued. "Back in Manhattan. They let me start showing new arrivals around the facility. Told me I had a calming effect. That's what the nurse said." He chuckled as if even he found that a little unbelievable. "Guess when you've been through enough chaos, you start craving calm." "You're doing good work," Neil said, genuinely impressed. "It's not all," Walt added. "Colonel Holloway stopped by last week. Said he'd been keeping tabs. Mentioned you'd moved into full-time work with the network, that the center here in Junction was getting good marks." Neil smiled. "Still figuring it out, but yeah. It's coming together." "Well," Walt said, shifting his weight slightly, "he wants me to come down twice a month, talk to vets who've been isolated a while, share my story, maybe do some peer support." "What's incredible. Depends on how much coffee they've got." Neil laughed, and for a moment the office felt brighter than its beige walls could ever reflect. Walt's expression softened. "I never told you, but I used to work in heating and cooling, too. Back in the day, after the war, before things got messy." Neil's eyes widened. "You're kidding." "Nope. Split systems, ductless minis, rooftop units. Did it all. My hands still remember the motions, even when the rest of me forgets names." They stood there in quiet recognition for a moment. Two men from different generations, shaped by different paths, but bonded by something invisible and undeniable. "You know," Neil said, "I've been trying to start a work therapy program here. Something to give guys purpose again. Teach 'em skills that translate. Problem is, I don't have anyone to run it." Walt's eyes twinkled, just a little. "You asking?" "I am." "Then I'm in," he said. 3 weeks later, the community center's back garage had been transformed into a workshop. The benches were old but sturdy. Tools had been donated by local contractors. The place smelled like sawdust and solder and coffee. They started small, 2 veterans, then 4. Some were older, some barely out of their 20s. Walt taught them the basics, how to wrap electrical tape the right way, how to test a capacitor without frying yourself, how to shut off the water supply to a leaking heater before the basement floods. Neil stood beside him when needed, took notes, handled the paperwork, brought donuts. But what mattered most wasn't what they built. It was how they looked when they walked in, defensive, hunched, unsure, and how they looked when they left, straighter, warmer, seen. One morning, Callie showed up unannounced. She walked through the side door, toolbox in hand. "I heard you're taking in lost causes," she said. "You're late," Walt grinned. She stayed. By spring, local businesses were asking to partner. One offered apprenticeships, another donated insulation and copper tubing. Word spread. People started showing up, not just for help, but to offer help. One rainy Tuesday, Neil stepped into the office and found a letter on his desk. No stamp, just folded by hand. He opened it. "I don't know what kind of man you were before that night at the motel, but I know who you are now. You're the reason this place exists, the reason people like me start to believe again. I may have worn a uniform once, but you gave me something mine never did, a second chance." Neil set the letter down, heart thudding quietly. The office beyond the glass buzzed with noise, grinding tools, laughter, someone cursing cheerfully about a stripped screw. And it hit him, full force like warm sun breaking through snow. It built something, not alone, but it had started with him. With a mission, not with a plan. Just a knock on a motel counter, a cold night, and a choice. He didn't need a medal. He had purpose, people, a new kind of family. And for the first time in a long time, Neil Curtis finally believed in luck. The good kind, the kind you earn when no one's watching.